So I'll now go ahead and introduce our next speaker and also our lunch presenter. Our next speaker is Christopher Collard. Christopher is a senior analyst at the Utah Foundation, where his research in infographics have been recognized by national awards. That work is driven by two aspirations: to compose nuanced research that captures multiple points of view and deconstruct large data sets into comprehensive details in order to form decisions. Christopher's concentrations at Brigham Young University in international relations, Portuguese, Arabic, and math, I'm just teasing him, he's just like a polyglot, polymath, I mean. Lots of interest there. Culminated in a Master of Public Policy from the University of Utah. His curiosity tends to make him something of a serial hobbyist with current interest in astronomy and bookbinding, which we need to talk about because my wife builds books too. It's a lot of fun. I've even done a little myself. We look forward to hearing from Christopher. So without further ado, please welcome Christopher Collard from the Utah Foundation. His presentation, I should have said, is titled Social Capital in Utah, the Role of Teachers. Thank you.
So I'll use the microphone since your teachers seem to have picked up some habits from your students and everyone's sitting in the back. Social capital is what I get to talk about today. This is something we've been just to introduce a little bit, Utah Foundation. We're a nonprofit organization. We're focused on researching public policy issues. Robert highlighted that I have diverse interests. This is a job that lets me kind of exercise those diverse interests. I'm currently working on a project looking at police retention and recruitment. I just came off a report looking at digital education and how the COVID pandemic changed that. I look for the next month, I'll probably be working on water conservation again. So we're all over the place. We touch all sorts of different public policy topics. Utah Foundation, we'd love to be a resource for you as teachers. I was looking through some of our records, and back in 2000, the early aughts, I found some lesson plans that they would take our staff would take our reports and build lesson plans. Fortunately, we don't do that anymore because we're down to 2 people. We have a skeleton crew. But if you can think of a way for Utah Foundation to help you in your classrooms or stuff like that, reach out. We'd love to be a part of that. So Utah Foundation, Robert also talked about associations. Utah Foundation started out that way. Back in 1945, a bunch of essentially businessmen got together and they wanted to put together an organization they could take an independent view on government. Kind of form one of these organizations that provides a check and balance on government to make sure that they're kind of doing what they want and acting in a prudent manner. So that's kind of how we started, as one of these exact organizations. And I'm really happy because I love my job and I love that there's people willing to pay me to do it. It's super exciting. But anyway, social capital. We spent a lot of time working on this project. It took about 2 years. We had a couple of annual luncheons where we managed to get Robert Putnam and then also one of his co-authors, Shaylin Romney Garrett, they came and presented some of our topics or some of our annual conferences. So it's been something we focused on for a while. But just to kind of give a background, explaining social capital. So first of all, social capital is a type of capital. Traditional economists, if you look back at Adam Smith, he defined capital as essentially stuff that you use to make other stuff. So often when we think about capital, we just think about money, and we do use money to make other stuff. But it's like factory stuff, factory machines that you use to make other stuff. It's the buildings that you make that other stuff in. Anything you use. So you as teachers in your industries, the stuff you make is hopefully educated young humans. The capital in your classrooms would be the desks, the buildings you're teaching in, the whiteboards, the computers you use. All of that would just be considered as capital. The stuff you use to make other stuff. We also have human capital, which is me and you. Well, we bring certain skills. We have our training, we have our education, we have talents that we bring to the table that we use to help make that stuff more educated young humans. But then, so those are two types of capitals. But then we also have social capital, where again it's looking at the stuff that we use to make other stuff. In this case, it's the social stuff we use to make other stuff. How do we use our personal networks? How do we use societal norms and leverage that into making other stuff? And so, just kind of give you a couple of examples. At like an individual level, I have a social network, right? One example is I have a neighbor. He is super into cars. He's always out working on his truck, doing something new to his truck. I'm not super into cars. I tend to fix my cars when they need it, generally after they need it. But he's kind enough to let me borrow his tools. I don't have to go sink hundreds of dollars into these tools specifically for cars because he lets me borrow them. Conversely, my wife is super into gardening, and we have a wide array of gardening tools. And my neighbor's wife also, is like she borrows our neighboring tools, and she doesn't have to sink hundreds of her dollars into gardening tools. She can just come borrow ours. So we have this norm of reciprocity. Did I mess that up? Reciprocal norms, right? Sharing. That's like one basic highlight of a social capital, right? And you can also like it's not just goods that this applies to, right? You can imagine this applies to services too. Like maybe I could get my neighbor to fix my car for me while my wife would go do stuff to their garden, or you can just even the exchange of information. Like my neighbor loves talking about cars. So if he had a choice, that's what he'd talk about. I use that to my advantage when I'm troubleshooting, when I'm chatting with him, and I can figure out at least where to start looking when I'm trying to figure out a problem on my car. I can access his knowledge and as a shortcut, and I don't have to take hours and hours looking through YouTube videos trying to figure out what it is. Similar thing with my wife. She spent a lot of time in her garden. She knows a lot about what plants thrive in our local environment and what plants don't. And my siblings will often come to her where they can use her as a shortcut. They don't have to spend hundreds of dollars on plants only to see them die because they don't fit well in our environment, right? They can use her as a shortcut. So this is the sort of examples of social capital at an individual level. And you can kind of imagine how that applies to groups then as well. If you have groups, if you have an employer, my employer, for example, there's 3 of us, soon to be 2 of us. So it's not a large group. But my employer I can leverage my own social capital to help my employer. Because there's only 2 of us, we wear a lot of hats. One of my hats is also making video, like quick educational videos we can put on social media that try to distill our research down to 2 minutes. And I don't have a lot of background in making videos. But fortunately for me, my brother-in-law does. That's what he does for a living, right? So I can use that connection. I can have him help me, point me in the right direction, give me some tips on how we can make these production-ish quality. So these kind of groups work in groups too, leveraging these. And it also applies on like a more societal level as well. And then kind of as you work your way up to these broader and broader groups, you'll find that the kind of, the networks tend to be a little bit more tenuous. The trust is maybe a little bit thinner, but it stretches so much farther. Like I'm here today in this room with you, and I have a basic sense of trust. I trust that none of you are going to try and murder me today in the middle of my presentation, right? We have these societal norms that establish this baseline of trust. And I probably trust you a little bit more because you're the people who are entrusted to taking care of our children. So there's these societal baselines of trust that come from this social capital. And so and similarly at a societal level, we can act together to create governments to kind of hopefully that will kind of build the type of society we want to live in. So we get together and we collectively put someone in charge and we tell them, okay, go organize a police department so that we can have our laws and be governed. Go put together a court, a justice system, so that people will have to do what they say they do when they make a contract, enforce contract and stuff like that. So all of this is like an action of social capital at the social level. We have all of these different levels of it that we're going on. Even especially like schools, where we get together and we delegate the teaching of our children, both these societal norms that we decide are productive to society, as well as a broader rate of education, we delegate that to schools. And some people, they'll go out and actually hire someone to do it. They'll send the kid to private school. But collectively, public school is a collective action by people to try and build build the kind of society they want. One thing about social capital, it's kind of new. It's come up a couple times, like Alexis de Tocqueville, back in the late 1700s. He talked about it, kind of. But as a singular topic of study, it really hasn't been studied until like the 1990s. So there's only been 30 years of study on this. There's a lot of not disagreements, controversy. There's a lot of discussion about what social capital actually is, how to define it, how to classify it, how do you measure it. All of these are very, very much active topics of discussion. It's not quite like economics, which has been around since 1776. Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. They've had 200 years to get their story straight. And besides, it's mostly about money. Dollars. How do you? And that's so easily quantifiable. Dollars, and then you just put everything else. My background is an economist. I love dollars, and I love the absurd efforts that we as economists go through to try and quantify everything in dollars. Whether that's the life of a human or like future dollars, how they compare against current dollars. Anyway, it's great for analysis that I can have a single unit and look. I can make. I can definitely say. I have to outline my assumptions. But I can definitely say this decision is more efficient than this decision because look at the dollars. Social capital doesn't have any of that. Like how do you measure social capital? How do you measure the strength of relationships? How many relationships you have? So this is super up for discussion right now. A lot of people take different routes. One of the most common routes, and the route we took at Utah Foundation when we were looking at social capital here in Utah, is we don't even try to measure social capital itself directly. We measure its outcomes, and we hope that our outcomes are linked enough to social capital that it's a fair enough representation. And so even what those outcomes are a matter of debate. And often what people tend to do is they tend to look at 4 or 5 different items and they form an index, and then hopefully that index is something that captures social capital. And so you'll see that on people do that on the national scale, and that's what we Utah Foundation did too. One other note about social capital. It's not like, I'm up here talking about social capital. Social capital is great. But social capital is not always great. There's a dark side to social capital, right? If you look at organized crime, if you look at gangs, those are very intense social bonds that draw people together to do terrible things. You can also just look at even more mundane matters like nepotism in government. Somebody leveraging their relationship with someone in power to get special benefits for them. So social capital in itself isn't a universal good. But rather what it is it's kind of like dollars in many ways. Again, I'm an economist. Looking at dollars, I love to look at dollars. It's not because dollars in themselves are great, but it's what people can do with those dollars, right? Dollars, I look at household income when I'm studying people, because that tells me what kind of resources can these individuals access when they run into trouble. It's kind of a shortcut that will help me understand those resources. And so when we're looking at social capital, it's not so much that social capital is great, it's that social capital is a measurement of resources that people can use. How can they rely on their personal connections to help themselves when they get into trouble or when trouble befalls them? These are resources that people can use. So that's our goal, measure these resources. And then hopefully, we can put this information out there and decision makers can use this to hopefully find ways to address people with fewer resources, find ways to help them, and figure out how we can use our resources as society in general to make society a better place to live. So I think I covered a couple more topics. That's why social capital is important right there. It measures resource. It's a measurement of resource. Types of social capital. People like to break down social capital into different ways. Robert talked a little bit about this, bonding versus bridging. That's one of the big breakdowns. Bonding is much more focused on tight-knit groups. So we mentioned I studied Arabic. I spent some time in the Middle East. I did a lot of my studies focused on that. In a lot of countries in the Middle East, society is very fractionalized. You have these groups that are broken down on religious lines, on economic lines, and they're very tight-knit groups. Like they're people support each other. They can't count on government to do it for them, so they take care of each other. But at the same time, these groups form a larger fractionalized society. So it's very, there's societies that are very, very, that have this bonding social capital is very intense. But it's less strong on this bridging social capital. Bridging social capital is much more focused on, it's kind of more of an outward focus. Usually bridging social capital, the sense of trust is a little bit less. Like one example is you guys have your schools, you have your classes, you know everybody there. That as you interact with each other, you're building these strong relationships. That's a good example of bonding social capital, right? But then you also come to these meetings. You meet people who do the same thing you do, just somewhere else in a different situation. And that's maybe a good example of bridging. And so there's these two different, those are two major differences between types of social capital that you can kind of categorize things with. Where this bonding is very much focused on kind of an in-group benefit, whereas bonding is much more focused on, it's much less strong, the ties aren't really there, but you can sometimes use it to get further ahead than you can with just bonding social capital. And it's not, when we categorize these, I'm not saying one is better than the other. They both have their uses, but there's something to keep in mind. And so I'm going to get now into some of the Research Utah Foundation. Oh, well, no, I'm not. First, I'm going to talk about kind of the national discussion. And Robert talked a little bit about this too. You mentioned, this trend of downward trend of social capital. It's a big story. We had Robert Hudman present, we had Shaylin Rami Garrett present, and this is kind of the research. And a lot of this research right here is very much so focused on social capital as, it's very much focused on kind of a we. Do we see ourselves as a collective, or do we see ourselves as individuals? And so they do a lot of other research too, but this specific research here that I'm going to show you is much more focused on this I, we, I. It's called the I, we, I pattern. If you notice, back in the early 1900s, there was a lot of polarization, there was little political comedy. Comedy? I don't know if I'm saying that right. Comedy, maybe? And it was very much an individual situation. Then when we get into the 60s and the 70s, there's much more of there's much higher level of political comedy, lower polarization. And then since then we've gone back down. So they call it this I, we, I pattern. And so they saw it across all of these different measures they would use. And like I said earlier, what they did is they took a half dozen measures and they combined it together into a single metric. So they did that here with polarization. They did it with economic equality. It's a little bit more bumpy, but kind of you see this same trend that has been decreasing since the 1960s and 1970s. You see the same trend again with social cohesion, looking at how well society binds itself together. And again, you see the same thing with cultural solidarity. And again, it all follows this pattern of decrease. And I want to say again that the study of social capital is not uniform, it's not monolithic. This is the research of Robert Putnam and Shaylin Rami Garrett, who are probably some of the biggest names doing it, but there's a lot of people out there who disagree with them. They argue that, we might be more individualistic as a society, but that doesn't necessarily mean our social capital is going down. For example, one argument is that individualism forces individual members of society to become more dependent on each other and each other's actions. Voluntary cooperation and partnership between individuals are only possible when people have autonomy, self-control, and a sure sense of responsibility. So again, there's a lot of people who think a lot of different things when it comes to social capital. It's very much an emerging, it's an exciting place to be. The study, just because there's a lot going on, a lot of people making these exciting arguments. But moving on to social capital in Utah. Utah Foundation, like I said, it's a hard thing to measure. We focus a lot on outcomes. This project probably took about 4 years for us to put together, and half of that time was us arguing with each other about what metrics to include. Our goal in this was to find something that we could compare Utah against other states, and then we could also compare over time. So it was also difficult, that challenge of finding data out there that tracks in all 50 states, and that's been around for 20 years or more. So that's kind of why we made a lot of these decisions we did regarding what data we chose to use. But first, one of the first things we looked at is family formation. If you look at your social networks, your strongest ties are most likely with your family. I'm just thinking, my wife got in a car accident on Saturday, and within the hour, both my parents and her parents had both offered to let us use their cars while we got the insurance all figured out. I mean, having a family there that you can fall back on in emergencies, it's a super strong sense of social capital. Like, it's that bonding social capital. And it's probably one of the strongest sources of social capital. So we looked at family formation. And this is a lot of just like, we wanted to look at, for example, marriage. Households that have 2 adults in them, they're going to have a lot more, generally speaking, it's not always the case, but generally speaking, households with 2 adults are going to have more social capital than households with 1 adult. And we also looked at very similar measures where we looked at children as well. You see Utah here, we're top of the nation in terms of the share of adults married. We looked at births to married women, Utah's also the top of the nation there. And also we looked at a very similar measure, the share of children in single-parent families, where Utah is conversely, but a good thing, on the lowest end of the spectrum there. I mean, so if we look at just family formation, Utah comes across looking really good, right? Utah's doing really good in family formation. The next question is like, how well developed are those family ties? And this is a super interesting finding. Like I said, we've been doing this report for 4 years. We had some preliminary data here, and what we found is that while Utah has great family formation, like the ties between the family, not the best in Utah. It wasn't quite like, we aren't first in the nation like that family formation. But then something weird happened in 2020, and surprise, COVID changed things. And actually Utah improved a lot in its relationship compared to other states. So that was fun, really interesting to see happen, fascinating part of our research. One of the things we talked about was, I don't know, can you imagine, like, how would you go about, sorry, I'm talking a lot, but if any of you have any questions, I don't know, if you want to say something, go ahead and shout it out. I've had people just yell at me, "You're wrong," in the middle of my presentation before, and it's a little bit startling, but I've learned how to handle it. But anyway.
All the time, so.
Yeah, I mean, you get all the time. You're right. You're pros at that. Yeah. I mean, so if you do, just let me raise your hand or speak up, and I can try to answer any questions. Or I've covered a lot of ground so far. But going forward, feel free to speak up or yell at me or give ideas if I'm running out of ideas, or say whatever's on your mind. Okay, so it's hard to determine the strength of family bonds, right? So we looked for some maybe shortcuts. Well, those shortcuts might be how much time parents spend reading to their children. I'm sure this is an important metric to use teachers, because that metric, parents reading to their children, is super connected to their success in schools. But it's also a measure of the strength of family time. How much parents are investing in their children, in those developing those family bonds. And you can see here, Utah's kind of in the middle. We don't show up all that great. But back in 2019, we were like 7th lowest. We made a lot of progress here. We're just average now. We used to be below average. So that's a big jump. The next thing we looked at was the share that the children spent on time on TV. I guess what? During COVID, it went up by a lot, everywhere. So even though Utah children in 2020 spent more time on TV than they did previously, everywhere else just went up so much more. So we used to be kind of in the middle, and we dropped down to the lower ends of the time that our children spend. Well, no, this is the share of children who spend 4 or more hours on TV or electronic devices per day. That blows my mind. I don't want to think about that too much. That's just a lot of time. And then the other metric we chose to look at was the share of parents, or the share of eating meals together as a family. And this is actually when we saw the biggest differences. Back in 2019, we were actually like 11th lowest in the nation, and then we jumped up to 7th best. And this is something that everybody saw. I mean, you see in this graph, Arizona's kind of down there on the far end, the yellow bar. They used to be 7th best in the nation. They actually did better in 2020 than they did in 2019. It's just everywhere else did so much better than that. Anyway, so it's just really fascinating to see the change that the coronavirus had on how families spend time together. Yes, the one in the very back, on the very back wall.
So I'm intrigued by this recreational electronic media, because it's kind of being like this is a negative thing. But what if part of that 4 hours is the family playing Mario Kart together?
That's a good call. None of these metrics are perfect. We use electronic time spent on electronic devices, mainly as a counterpoint, as if they're not, if they're on electronic devices, they're watching TV or playing Mario Kart, they're not out building, playing on sports. They're not out on their dance competition teams. They're not out playing with their friends, building, social relationships that way. But you're right, there are methods that you can do that. And some will also argue that social media, you could be on social media, and that is a hot topic over how much social media actually contributes towards social capital. Some people argue it will, some people argue it won't. But there's degrees there. It depends on how you use it. But yeah, you could be building social capital that way. I would argue that's not the majority of the case. If you're spending 4 hours a day, each day, every day of the week, that's probably not all spent with your family on Mario Kart playing games. And then behind you in the gray cardigan.
I'm interested in how this information was accessed. Because when you brought up the topic family quality, I thought to myself, how would you know the quality of what happens in someone's private home?
That's a great question. I had no idea how to do that. So we're hoping these metrics capture at least some of that. And these are survey metrics. So these ones, I believe, are part of the American Community Survey. I've got it all in my methodology notes. I can't remember it on the spot. I've got 30 metrics here. This was survey data. I don't think it was an American Community Survey. It was supplemental data they ask it once a year in September. That's what I can remember. And it's part of a larger survey body. Yeah?
I was just going to say, from the point of view of a grandmother and what happened to our family during COVID, the amount of time you spend on FaceTime with and I have 4 sons, but 3 of them live out of state.
Yeah.
So a lot of quality time, and then I actually had one of my sons suggest that we do Laurie Santos's Coursera course on the nature of happiness together as a family.
Yeah.
And so that brought us really close together, even though we were disparate. We didn't see each other in person because we lived geographically so far away, but the quality of our family actually skyrocketed because of COVID.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons, there's so much argument about social media and how electronics can bring us together. Right now, in kind of the social capital discussion right now. It's definitely a hot topic. But so in this, Utah actually predicts standing a lot. One of the big questions we have is this going to stick? Or are we going to kind of fall back to the norm in the past? This is an area where Utah potentially won't do as well in the future if we revert back to historic norms. Utah's doing really well right now, but I'm excited to see how that looks 4 years from now when we plan on taking this measurement again. So that was talking about family health, right? We also looked at a series of metrics looking at how people are involved in their community. One of the ways is donating time and money. So there's another, I think the same survey asked about whether they contribute, what share of people contributed $25 or more to a local charity. And we thought that this highlighted social capital because you're not going to give your money to somebody you don't trust. If you're donating money, you're trusting somebody to put it towards the use that they're telling you, the good use that they're promising you. So Utah comes up here very, very high, especially among mountain western states. I think we were second in the nation, just right behind Colorado, just right behind South Dakota. Colorado was third. So the same thing again with volunteering. You're going out there, you're contributing to some sort of project without any expectation of recompense. That's not the right word. Compensation. And you're kind of building up these norms of reciprocity. I hope I'm getting that word right. And again, Utah's actually first in the nation this time. South Dakota came just behind. Similarly, we looked at neighborhood participation. And one of the things we looked at was neighborhood participation it was just religious participation. And so when we had Robert Putnam at our annual meeting, he claimed that half of all social capital is related to or generated in religious groups. This measure we're looking at here is those people who go to church or participate in their religious activities, once a week or more often. So I mean, these are people who are showing up with the same other people every week after week, as they try to do, their various religious obligations, whether that's becoming a better person or improving their community. And so just that repetition, like it's something so steady in these lives of people, and religion forms such an essential core of people's identity in many ways. So this was a big one. One of the things I wanted to look at was just like congregations per capita. Interestingly enough, but this turns out to be a bad metric for Utah. Mainly because the way the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the most common denomination in Utah, organizes itself differently from a lot of churches in say Tennessee. So if Utah's at 53%, Tennessee's just right on our coattails in terms of religious participation. But Tennessee has hundreds of these evangelical churches that are separate. I mean, it's not. In Utah we have one big church. In Tennessee they have dozens and hundreds of little churches. So we couldn't find a good metric that could look at that. It was fascinating. What we really wanted to find out, but we settled on just like religious participation. And we see that Utah performs really well on that measure. Kind of similar, just looking at participation, again, in neighborhood, not necessarily religious participation, but these are the share of people who say they've done something to benefit they've worked together with their neighbors to benefit their community in the past 12 months. And again, Utah's first in the nation on this one too, 45%. That's like more than twice the national average. This is like the single metric where Utah just blows everyone else away. Like no one else is even close in terms of the share of people who report doing something good for their community in the past 12 months. So in terms of like this family formation, Utah ended up looking pretty good. In terms of this participation and volunteering and kind of being involved in the community, Utah also performs really well. Social cohesion is a little bit of a different story. So social cohesion, I talked a little bit about this in terms of like my experience with the Middle East. How you have a lot of really intense but fractionalized groups. And one question is like, if you're measuring social capital, this bonding versus bridging, like in which case is social capital optimized? And it's a great discussion. You can have these really tight-knit immigrant groups, but they're cut off from larger society by language barrier. But within their group, everyone takes care of each other, and they have this really strong sense of community. So it's kind of this like where do you find the balance? And so what we did is we tried to focus mostly on really broad measures of social cohesion to try and measure this. So the first one we did was looking at the share of houses that are middle class. And so if you just look, we looked at the median income and we said everyone between 2/3 and twice that income we'll classify them as middle class. And Utah comes out on the top, although there are a whole bunch, really, most of the states in the Mountain West really perform well on this measure, with the exception of New Mexico. Another one we looked at was, you see Utah up there at the top. Another one we can look at is kind of social cohesion, like what's the share of people that are like me. I was born in West Valley. I went to school in Provo and then Salt Lake, and then I settled in Kearns and ultimately lived like 8 minutes away from the house I grew up in. Versus Dr. Burton, who is originally from Alberta, and he settled here, right? So looking at the difference, I have huge institutional Utah knowledge. He has limited institutional knowledge. He knows a lot more about St. George in the 1900s. I'll give him that. But I have a lot of friends here. My network is much more established here because I've been around forever. And so we want to look at the share of people, kind of from their state that's grown up there. And Utah actually doesn't, Utah, well, if you look at all Western states here, almost all of them are in the lower half. So if you look at the Western United States, it's a big target for immigration. There's a lot of people coming to the West. But Utah was definitely unique among the West in that roughly 60%, roughly 60% of everyone in this room grew up here in Utah. And so this was interesting just because, we don't stand out strong in the nation, but we stand out strong in the West. So that's kind of how we looked at social cohesion. In Utah, well, there was something else. Oh yeah, language. So we also looked at people with limited language proficiency, both adults and children. Oh, sorry, I missed your hand. Yeah?
I have a question on that back slide.
On the back slide? Yeah,
Does this play any correlation to, growth, like, a lot of people think our growth is coming from outside, but from what I'm maybe taking from this is that 60% of that in growth is in growth. Like
yeah,
our
so
kids
in
are-
Utah, we get both.
Can you repeat the question?
So she was asking like how much of like what share of the growth comes from outside and what comes from inside. And so we get substantial amounts of growth from both. I'm on a community planning council, and often citizens will come up saying we don't want more growth. We want our communities to remain the same. It's like, well, the way to do that is have a terrible economy, so nobody wants to come here and ship your kids out. But nobody wants that either. Anyway, so it's a hard line to walk. A lot of what we do at Utah Foundation, we also have I haven't been working on this project as much. It's been much more my coworkers, but we've been putting together a big series on how to grow in such a way that it doesn't impact people as much as they feel like they hate growth. How do we grow without making people hate it? It's kind of one of the big series we've been working on. But yeah, we do have large amounts of growth. We do have a lot of people coming in from outside. It's definitely both. In terms of language, looking at the number of children, we're kind of in the lower 2/3, and then with adults, we're kind of roughly in the middle. One really thing interesting about this is the median. If you look at the outlying U.S., it's really high compared to like the middle of the graph, and that's because the states, the largest states, are the states with the largest share of people, like Texas, California, New York. They're the states with the highest share of people with limited English proficiency. And we looked at this because, like I talked about earlier, immigrant communities might be really self-contained in a lot of ways and might really support each other, but they're cut off from a lot of the more bridging kind of network. A lot of government services are provided primarily in English. We hopefully are doing pretty good to reach out to them. I hope as a government. But their networking opportunities are somewhat more limited. So this social cohesion, Utah doesn't perform all that well. It's kind of like middling. We're kind of middling compared to the rest of the nation overall. Another, I talked a little bit, now I'm getting into some of these measures that are more about, maybe more like bridging social capital, where we look at how we work as a wider society. And so one of the things we want to look at is social trust. And so I've seen a lot of news articles talking about how proclaiming Utah is the fraud capital of the world. And by some metrics it is. It's really interesting to think about fraud from a social capital perspective, because you have people taking advantage of social trust, but at the same time it destroys social trust. So like when you're measuring this, like which way does it go? Like I don't know. Is high amounts of fraud good because that means lots of people are trusting other people? Or is high amounts of fraud bad because people are tearing this system of trust down? I don't know. It's interesting to think about. It's not one of my favorite metrics because of that. But we do have Utah kind of comes out here in the middle. Nothing impressive, just kind of on the lower end. But one of the more interesting metrics I found, we didn't originally plan on this metric because I didn't know it existed, but as I was diving into this data, I think I found it. So in our justice system, there's something called I can't remember what it's called, a breach of trust penalty, and it's where people get an extra bad sentence because they were acting in some sort of position of trust and they breached that trust. So if you have a doctor that takes advantage of their position to do bad things to children, that would be kind of like a breach of trust situation, because they're in this trusted position as a doctor. Lawyers are in this position. Teachers, if you do something bad with your position as a teacher, you'll get extra penalized because you used your position as a teacher to do something bad. So this is really interesting. But Utah actually performs really well in this. Like it's pretty crazy how much this doesn't happen in Utah compared to everyone else. And I think, yeah, we even had to this data bounced around a lot from year to year just because there's only so many court cases and stuff. So we have just over 3 years, and even though their 3-year average is still just astonishingly low compared to everyone else. That was just one of my, I don't know, I was fascinated by that one. So on this level of social, yeah.
I have a question on this, which I'd like your opinion on.
Mm-hmm.
I teach in Alpine School District, I live in Orem, and currently there's a group of people in Orem trying to separate from Alpine School District.
I saw the vote no on Proposition 2 on my drive
There is
in.
so much vitriol if you live in Orem.
Yeah.
And to me, it looks like a breach of social trust, meaning there's a large community in Orem who looks at Alpine School District and its teachers as the enemy of their children.
Mhm.
And if you listen to the ads or you read the emails, there's a lot of anger. Can you explain this phenomena as like in the?
And through a lens of social capital?
Yeah,
Yeah. So I think this is a great example of like the difference between bridging and bonding social capital. You have a group of people in Orem who view themselves in a very specific way, you know, that, I don't know. I lived in Utah County for a while. I love Utah County. I felt this is a great feeling about being in Utah County. You know, they see, but one of the biggest problems one of the biggest problems with bonding social capital is oftentimes what builds the in group. Sometimes it demonizes the out group. And that's where, you know, one of the focuses of this conference is like building bridges. How do we fight against that? So in this case, it's some people like they have a very strong social network from the sound of it. From all the yard signs I see up, like there's a really strong in-group feeling from Orem on this matter. But yeah, it's like they have an in-group and they've set an out-group, and if you're in that out-group, sometimes you get demonized. What are the other dark downsides of bonding social capital, I guess? Yeah?
Well, not on this topic, but I have another question before you change.
Okay. I don't know. I don't think I have much else to say. Anyone else? Yeah.
So like 6 slides ago, you had the timeline of social groups in the United States over time.
Mhm.
And during the war years, post-World War I up until the 1960s, it's growing. And then it declines after the 60s. Do you think the fact that there isn't an out-group to unify the country plays into that? Or are we just returning to a norm pre-World War I?
That's a really interesting question where we don't have. What was I thinking about? I was thinking about this the other day, something very much along those lines. I guess not so much in these terms, but that's a very interesting perspective that you don't have an out-group that you can demonize, that can strengthen maybe the country as a whole. I mean, even during the 70s and 80s, like you had communism as the big bad to help unify. Like that's a very interesting perspective. I hope we don't need another war in order to become a more unified society. That's a tragic thought. But very plausible. Does someone else have a question? Yeah.
So on this screen, on the bottom, it says penalties for breach of trust per million by state. Is that penalties like as in, well, I'm sorry, I was reading in the red. Breach of trust penalties in Utah are the lowest. So are we talking about someone convicted of breach of trust, their penalty is the lowest?
Yeah,
Or are we saying
no,
there are
sorry.
less people with the penalty?
The share of people convicted
Share of people convicted.
with a penalty of trust, penalty added to their conviction, is the lowest in the nation. So I guess one alternative is that we're here in Utah, we're just really good at getting away with it. I hope that's not the case, but that's also a plausible explanation. Yeah.
I'm just curious, would you be willing to send out this slide? Because I've got friends that would be very interested.
Yeah, I'm happy. They know I've got it set up with them. I think they'll share it with you. But also reach out to me, Utah Foundation, Christopher at UtahFoundation.org. And I'm happy to point you to this. We've got a whole lot more research. Each one of these we've got a report on each one of these, and we can really dive. Not as much as I would like, but you can dive more into it. Yeah.
So what's happening in South Dakota?
Oh, South Dakota. No, that was a big question. Like I see this big jump in South Dakota, and it turns out there was this. This is another question. Like they also were really high in terms of government corruption, and a lot of it comes down to like prosecutors. Prosecutors in some places might be more aggressive in doing it. And so in South Dakota, that's kind of what happened here during this time period is there was a combination of some really aggressive prosecutors that came in, and then there was a lot of fraud going on between reservation and non-tribal lands and non-tribal lands. So there's a lot of stuff going on in that range. I didn't dive in too much to it once I figured out, like that was enough for me to know about South Dakota. My focus was primarily on Utah. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so social trust. Utah, we were really good on the breach of trust penalties. We come out looking pretty all right. Not the top, but probably in the top 10 overall on social trust. I just got the circle. Next, we looked at civic engagement. This is what you think about voting being. How can you leverage your social capital, your relations, into political change, the political change you want, was kind of our goal. So one of the things we looked at was just voting. This was really interesting because Utah, at least in, you probably don't, you're social studies teachers. Utah is terrible at voting. We have some of the lowest voting turnout rates in the nation. Didn't always used to be that way. Back in the 50s and 60s, it was a different story, but in the early aughts, 2010s, we were pretty low. Then in 2016, we did something new and exciting, and it was called mail-in ballots. And 2016 and 2018, we surged ahead. We became, we beat the average. And in 2020, everyone else did the same exact thing. So now we're back. Now we're back below average. We were one of the pioneer states. There were 5 other states. Utah was one of them. We got ahead of the rest, and now everyone else has just caught up with us. So that was really interesting. We come out, kind of more or less in the middle, a little bit on the lower end. Yeah.
Does the research show that in swing states that voter turnout is higher, and maybe that's kind of the reason why Utah is
That was
great?
one of the things we were really interested in seeing, and we couldn't. It wasn't as consistent as we had hoped. There does seem to be some impact, but there's a lot of other things that go into factor into the decision as well. Like how easy is it to vote? Mail-in voting makes it easier, but also like individual races in each one. Oh, also in 2016, 2018, I think it was 2016, which is our year. 2016. One of the reasons I think it was also high was I think we had 5 ballot issues on that. With the medical marijuana, the redistricting, that our schools now, that didn't actually make the ballot. There are 2 others that aren't coming to mind. So that was also that's something like that really drives, perhaps drives our voter turnout as well. We also looked at the attendance of people in public meetings, and this is low everywhere. Not a lot of people go to public meetings, but in Utah we do substantially better than the rest of the nation. So Utah is definitely one of the top 5 states in terms of people who go to public meetings, but still it's only 1 in 6. As someone who is a chairperson over a public meeting, I see this, when I go to do my community council to approve a water tower. There's just nobody showing up in the audience. We got a whole lot of participation on the time we talked about redistricting horses out of rezoning horses out of Harriman. We got a lot of people there for that one. So it kind of depends on the topic. Yeah.
Do you think that goes back to social trust? That there's trust in leaders, we don't need to show up?
That's a good question. Do you trust your leaders so much you don't bother to show up to your meeting? Maybe. It's a good point. Yeah, but I think it's like saying you trust, I don't know, I worry that, or I wonder if that's trusting in the majority to do things and kind of reverting back to this tyranny of the majority that Dr. Burton mentioned. But it could be. There's another hand that went down. Yeah?
I think it's, for me personally, my husband was our local city council as well, and I think it's just this, at least, I'm sure it's in every state, but in Utah, families, we're teachers, we're this, it's just one more thing.
One more thing.
And it's just a disconnect. It's not, I think that it's not that people don't care. I used to.
That's super interesting because of the next thing I have coming up. You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Organizations. So, Dr. Burton already read the quote from Alexis de Tocqueville. I think it's a super cool quote, so I'm going to read it again. He said, Americans of all ages, all conditions, all minds constantly unite. Not only do they have commercial and industrial associations in which I'll take part, but they also have 1,000 other kinds: religious, moral, brave, futile, very general, very particular, immense, and very small. So maybe this idea of just we've got so much going on, how many can you really show up to? So we wanted to look at this. We looked at organizations. And more specifically, the IRS, they keep a big database of all the nonprofit organizations. So we looked at this big database of nonprofit organizations, found, used their tax records to figure out which ones are active. So we're not just looking at all the dead ones that are just slowly rolling on. And then compared to how many people, put it on a per capita basis. I think it was per 100,000. Yeah. And Utah doesn't look good in any of these. So first we have advocacy organizations, specifically organizations dedicated to changing public policy. A lot of those are issue-based. Utah's in the bottom 10. The number of non-professional associations. So a lot of these are like, like orchestra, if you're part of an orchestra, or even like attend a nonprofit, have season tickets to a nonprofit orchestra or something like that. Recreation clubs, sports, anything that's just not related to your job and not related to kind of pushing public policy. Utah's last in the nation in terms of the number of organizations per capita. And again, with professional associations, again, very, bottom third. Not the worst, but bottom third. Yeah?
So that doesn't include young men's and young women's associations.
It doesn't, but you know what? We looked at that too. Same thing. I don't have the graph pulled up, but it was the same thing. Just in terms of per capita associations, Utah just doesn't have great. Surprisingly, Montana and Idaho, Montana and Wyoming, look, Wyoming's in the top 5 in all of those. Just the number of associations they have out there in Wyoming per person. I mean, admittedly, we don't have a lot of people, but they have a good amount of associations for everyone that they do. Yeah. I hope you weren't, I didn't offend you because you're from Wyoming.
No.
Okay.
5-minute warning, that's all.
Okay, 5-minute warning, right. Yeah.
For association though, does that discount church association?
So church associations would show up in the number of non-professional associations.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one thing we had is, we have a lot of people committed to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's a deep commitment that takes up a lot of their time. And maybe that commitment, especially with the young men, they have a strong young men, young women program. Maybe that explains why there's less young men, young women clubs. Are people so they spend so much time on this single organization that we don't have as many as other organizations? We didn't really answer that question. That was one of the things we thought about. Yeah.
Does that include Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts?
Yeah. Yeah. So they would be, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts would be part of the Young Men, Young Women Association.
Okay.
Which I don't have that graph up here, but it's the same story.
Not anymore.
Not anymore?
Yeah. I'm just wondering if you had that data before 2019.
Oh,
Yeah.
So this is something that didn't really change from 2020. Well, so we're not asking people how much do you do in your organizations. That would be a really interesting question. I wanted that question so badly. I want a question like, how many clubs are you part of? How much time do you spend going to these different associations? But that data just doesn't exist. The best we could get is the number of associations that exist, that are active, and then divide that by the population. Yeah.
Would sports clubs have anything to do with this? Because I have 4 kids and they're doing all different sports. They don't have the time to do these non-professional organizations. To me, that sports is a non-professional organization.
No, it exactly is. But if your kids are doing it, we put it in the youth group. But if you were doing it, we put it in the non-professional.
But so if my kids are doing it,
you don't have time.
I don't have time to do it.
Yeah, and so that was one of the things when back in 2019 when we were looking at how little Utah invested in its children, reading to children, family dinners. When we were on the low end back in 2019, we had this report halfway written, and we're like, well, maybe it's because we have so many kids that we can't do everything for everybody. I don't know. Maybe you're too busy taking your kids to 3 different soccer practices that you don't have time for dinner every week. Maybe that's it. But then we did so much better in 2020. Yeah, just to wrap it up, I guess, so overall, we did a little bit more about social mobility, getting a degree, Utah does pretty well in terms of getting a degree. In terms of home ownership, building yourself in the middle class, Utah does pretty well. In terms of engaging youth in education, making sure that they are either in class or working and not just gaming in their mom's basement. Utah does pretty well on that too. We have relatively few people gaming in their mother's basement. And overall, we found this trend, Utah's, based on these metrics we use, Utah's first in the nation in terms of its social capital, once we aggregated all these different metrics together. And then also we were able to trace it back to 2013, not a long historical sense. But we did see overall, both in Utah and the United States, at least since 2017, we've seen an increase. And a lot of that has been driven by the number of people voting, like that just shot everybody up. The number of people, again, everybody increased in terms of having meals with their children and having reading to their children. Those were another big boost. So it'll be really interesting going forward to see if we can maintain that or if we go back down a little bit. One of the bringing it home, like what can teachers do about this? Is that what
That was gonna be my question. Yeah, I was curious your thoughts.
I don't know. I have personal experience from that. I had 2 teachers who used their social network to my benefit. I had my high school biotech teacher pushed me towards an internship in biotech. And I was really interested in the class. I hated the internship. And I'm so grateful I did the internship then, and I learned that I hated it then, that I didn't waste any more time on that. Like, that was enough of that STEM stuff. And then the other one. So my social studies teacher, he sat me down and said, "This is an organization. We're looking for leadership positions." I'm like, "I don't want a leadership position. I'll show up in hell. I can do that." And he's like, "No, these are the 4 positions we have. Which one are you going to take?" And I'm like, "Well, I guess I'll take this one." And then I had to go do stuff, and I had to be in charge of this organization, this youth group. We did community gardens, and we sold the produce and farmers market, and we donated some other stuff to food, some sort of food. I wasn't in charge of that. I was in charge of growing stuff. That was my job. But then that's where I met my wife. So like these are huge. I don't know, like teachers. If you can use like to some degree, to the degree appropriate, using your own, using your own network to help benefit the lives of your students, I think goes a long way. It went a long way in my life. That's all. I think off of the observation N of 1, it goes a long ways. Also the director of the Center for Constitutional Studies also mentioned, asking you to kind of direct prospective students their way to try and get into, going out there, being aware of these opportunities for your students, and then directing them to it. I think that goes a long way. But I guess one other way is me as a parent, after doing all this study, I'm like, wow, the social capital is so cool. Like, I'm a member of a community. I don't know. Doing this study made me think a lot about my place in my community, particularly in my neighborhood, but in my society, and like, what should I do more to help? Like, how can I be more active there? How can I more benefit there? And also, just like in my discussions with my kids. They're still pretty young, but it turned from like. I don't know, it made it a more, I've had discussions on like, what does it mean to be a member of a community? It means you help and other people help you. That's the level we're at, they're 5 and 9. We'll get more advanced topics, but being more conscious about what you're teaching people. We as society hand our kids off to you as social study teachers. You're largely, kindergarten teachers do go a long way in terms of socializing and doing norms for kids. But in terms of adult norms, like we leave it all up to you guys essentially. Like you're the ones in charge of like teaching kids about adult norms in public society, in terms of like how to be involved in your community, in terms of like civic engagement. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear any of your guys' ideas. Yeah.
Well, I think there's this bridging and bonding concepts, and in many ways teachers do a lot on the bridging side. This is more about the bonding side, if I'm understanding right. And teachers are, as you were saying, primary agents in bridging, bringing together children, getting them to talk across and understand differences. Many of the things we would call civic skills and dispositions are developed in the classroom by you guys. So I think that's an important thing for this whole concept. In this conference, we'll do the bridging and we'll do the bonding, and you guys are so important in the bridging.
Yeah, you come across a lot of kids in a lot of different situations. You can certainly help bring them together and break them out of their standard groups.
I'm not remembering the author of this, from cultural wealth theory.
And if social capital is a form of wealth, and with our underrepresented communities, specifically Latino communities, if we can let our students know that there is a great form of wealth in your own communities, network and social capital there, it helps to show them that they may not have the economic strength, but they have the social capital networking strength that they can use to prosper and go forward.
Yeah, so helping people recognize what access, that they do have access to these resources. They might not have the dollars resources that I'm so interested in, but they do have these other resources available to help them. Any other thoughts? No, doesn't look like it. Is it because it's lunchtime, right? That's why. It's lunchtime. Let's go have some lunch. I guess, yeah, so I mean, social capital, Utah does great. You guys are a big part of it. Thank you. On behalf of me, you know, think about my social studies teacher and diverting me toward that program that made me, or helping me meet my wife. Thank you very much.